Welcome to day 3 of the Ultimate Depression Survival Kit, How to Overcome and Master Depression with me, Dr. Moses Simuyemba. Today we're looking at the biggest secret to overcoming depression. What is the biggest secret? Well, it has a wealth of knowledge you can use immediately. The biggest secret is simply you, yourself. And so you have it already right now. More specifically, it is understanding yourself. Why is that so? Well, only by deeply understanding yourself can you get a grasp on understanding the possible roots of your depression, choosing the most effective ways to overcome your depression, and finding long-term and lasting solutions to your depression. You will recall that on day 1, we covered how to deal with depression from a whole person perspective, and we covered understanding the risk factors for depression, things that contribute to risk of having depression, but also things that contribute to not recovering from depression. And therefore, when I say you are the key, I mean that you need to understand yourself in terms of those risk factors and in terms of those factors that may be hindering you from overcoming depression. Things such as family history, major life events, past episodes of depression, childhood trauma, chronic illness, and chronic stress. And we did cover some of these on day 1. We will go in more detail on day 3 now to cover them in more detail and look at some of the research around them that shows why these are important things to consider for yourself as you plan to recover from depression. You also need to understand yourself in terms of habits, things like smoking, drug use, alcohol use. You need to understand yourself in terms of personality. There are certain personalities that are more prone to depression. You need to understand yourself in terms of diet. Did you know there are foods that protect you from depression, but also foods or diets that may put you at more risk of depression? And also in terms of your environment. So these are some of the factors you need to understand about yourself. So let's look now at one of the studies done on family history and past episodes of depression. By the way, when I present the research around depression in these various videos, I present it in very simple terms because I realize that not all of you have a science background. And so I don't want to bog you down with the science around this or the methodologies and so on. I simply stress who the author is, the title, and the major findings of their research so that you get the gist of it. For those of you that would like to get into more detail, I do present the actual papers for you to download under each day so you can read them in more detail. There is also the research summaries that I provided for you in PDF format that you can look at. That presents a little more detail, but just summarizes the research also. So you have all the tools you need to be able to look at this research in more detail. Going into Monroe et al. Study in 2014, it was published in 2014. The study was titled Life Stress and Family History for Depression, the Moderating Role of Past Depressive Events. And they found that 3 of the most consistently reported and powerful predictors of depression in literature is recent major life event. So something like a death of a loved one, a divorce, or, loss of a job or something like that. A positive family history for depression, having a close family member who has had depression, and past episodes of depression. So if you've had a previous episode of depression, you're more likely to have another episode of depression. And they noted that the literature says that family history of depression means that you are 1.5 to 3 times more likely to suffer from depression if a close family member has had depression. And they also note that history of other mental illness can present with symptoms of depression. So the study involved 62 individuals, and the findings were quite interesting. They found that participants who experienced a major life event prior to the onset of depression were less likely than participants who did not experience a major life event to have a positive family history of depression. In other words, those with a positive family history of depression are more likely to have depression even without or even in the absence of a major life event happening to them. And secondly, participants with a recent major life event had fewer lifetime episodes of depression than participants without. So this means that family history of depression is a strong predictor also of how many episodes of depression you might have. If you have a family history, you're more likely to suffer from multiple episodes of depression than if you had a major life event happen to you alone as the precipitator of your depression. So quite interesting findings here, and they emphasize that family history is a very strong predictor of whether you have depression in the first place and how recurrent that depression might be. And that is why it is very important to trace your family history and understand your family history in terms of depression. Now, like I said in the previous video on day one, this does not absolutely mean that you will have depression if a family member, a close family member, has had depression. It simply means your chances are higher, and therefore you need to have it higher on your radar when things start going wrong, when you start feeling a certain way. You need to be more suspicious that it could be depression because a family member has had it. But it doesn't absolutely mean that you will have it either. So don't become a hypochondriac in that sense and thinking you have depression when it's other things that are happening to you. Balance is required here, but nevertheless, the important message is be alert to your family history in terms of depression. Another factor that has been found to have links with depression is personality, would you believe it or not? So, psychologists talk about certain personality types, and they have found that some personality types are more prone to depression than others. Neuroticism, introversion, perfectionism have all been linked to depression. And personality is linked to depression because it affects how you handle life issues or life events, hence this link with depression. So understanding your personality can help you better handle your depression. It can help you understand your risk of depression as well as understanding how to handle your depression if you have it and how you can recover from it. Your personality affects a lot of things about your life. It affects what you like, what you dislike, your predispositions, your ways of handling stress, your ways of getting energized, your work, your recreation, your lifestyle. So it is very important to understand your personality. For instance, when it comes to ways of getting energized, I am more of an introverted person. So I find that I get energized more when I'm alone or in a quiet environment than if I'm out partying and in a crowded environment. But somebody who is an extrovert gets energized by being in such an environment which is noisy, full of people, lively, and so on. So it is important to understand that. But also that means that someone with my kind of personality, which is more introverted in its natural state, is more prone to isolation, which can be another factor that can contribute to depression. And therefore, that's why it's important to understand your personality. And ways of handling stress also hinge a lot on your personality. Some people thrive under stress to some extent, as long as it is not too much. But some people, just a little stress will take them over the edge. So it's important to understand your personality so that you understand all these things about yourself, what kind of work environment you prefer and work in, your recreation style and your general lifestyle, all hinge on your personality. And here are the big 5 personality traits that are often talked about in psychology that you need to understand. And the acronym for remembering them is OCEAN or CANOE, because the first letters can be arranged to spell those words, ocean or canoe. The first thing is openness to experience. So when it comes to openness, you can be inventive or curious, or you can be consistent and cautious. So some people like adventure, like new things. Other people like to be in a familiar environment and are more cautious about new things. Conscientiousness is another one. So you can be efficient and organized versus easygoing and careless. So that is an important personality characteristic. Extraversion is an important one that has been linked to depressions, and you can be outgoing or energetic versus solitary and reserved. And in this sense, the solitary and reserved has been found to be more prone to depression than the outgoing and energetic. Agreeableness is another, friendly and compassionate versus challenging and detached. And lastly, we have neuroticism, which is sensitive or nervous, or secure and confident. And when it comes to neuroticism, the sensitive and nervous personality type has been found to be more prone to depression than the secure and confident. So you can see that these are the big 5 personality traits. There are other classifications of personality, but these are the most commonly accepted by most people in psychology. And the important ones for depression, although the others also have links, is usually neuroticism and extraversion are the big ones, although there are also studies on openness and how that affects depression, as well as conscientiousness. But extraversion and neuroticism are 2 of the biggest ones that have been studied as far as depression goes. Here is one study by Van der Veen, published in 2017, just to illustrate the point. And this study was titled "The Importance of Personality and Life Events in Anxious Depression, from Trait to State Anxiety." And they found that the presence of a life event alone is not associated with the severity of anxiety or depression on its own. However, certain personality traits interacted with these life events in explaining anxiety severity. Remember, I said before that the personality affects how you handle what happens to you, how you handle life events, how you handle stress, and so on. And this study actually confirmed that. And they go on to say that analysis showed that life events were associated with higher anxiety levels in cases of high levels of neuroticism and openness, and low levels of conscientiousness or mastery. So remember, these neuroticism and openness are personality traits, and they found that there's a link with this and the severity of anxiety that one experiences from their life events. In the face of a life event, personality traits may play a central role in increased anxiety levels in late life depression. That was their finding from this study, because they studied depression in elderly people. You can read more about the study. That's the reference at the bottom of the slide there. The document is attached for you, and the summary as well in the summary PDF file. Here is a rather interesting study by Catherine et al. Done in 2018. By the way, when I say et al., it means there's more than one author, or more than 2 authors, because I can't write all of them. And so in science, we say et al. To mean that there are several other authors and we acknowledge them, but we can't list them all. They published a study called Vegetarianism, Depression, and the 5-Factor Model of Personality. And this study investigated personality traits between vegetarians and omnivores. Okay, so they found that although vegetarians and semi-vegetarians are more open to new experiences, they were more neurotic and depressed than omnivores. So here's the link to depression. They found that actually vegetarians had more of a neurotic kind of personality trait, and therefore they were also turned out to be more depressed than omnivores, who were less neurotic. As far as the other personality traits of conscientiousness and agreeableness or openness, these did not vary with the dietary habits. So these were interesting findings, because they point to the finding that, personality does affect even your dietary habits to some extent, and as well as can contribute to or affect your risk to depression. Hjort et al., I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, in 2018 also published a study titled Self-Perceived Personality Characteristics in Seasonal Affective Disorder and Their Implications for Severity of Depression. So seasonal affective disorder is also abbreviated as SAD, S-A-D. They found that in summer, the groups scored similarly on their personality traits, and the controls did not score any different in winter compared to summer. So, usually when you do a study, you have a group of people that suffer from a condition. Those are the group you are studying. And then you match them up with controls. Controls are people that do not suffer from that condition, because in science you want to compare whether there are differences between the group you are studying that has a certain condition you are studying, which in this case is seasonal affective disorder, or the controls who do not have seasonal affective disorder, and therefore you want to study what the differences are between the 2 groups. So when I mention controls, just bear in mind that's what that means. So they found that high scores on neuroticism in summer was associated with more severe depression symptoms in winter in individuals with SAD, with seasonal affective disorder. So neuroticism here was a personality trait that predicted your whether or not you have SAD in winter. If you know anything about SAD, you know that it's seasonal affective disorder. That's why it's seasonal, meaning individuals who suffer from this suffer more from depression during winter days, or winter season. They further found that in winter, individuals with SAD scored higher on neuroticism and lower on extraversion, both compared to controls and to their own summer scores. So here's an interesting thing. The personality actually varied in these individuals. In summer, they were less neurotic than in winter, when they were more neurotic, and in winter is when they suffered from SAD. Okay, but the controls, there was no change much in their scores on neuroticism, whether it was summer or winter. So the results of this study support that neuroticism may present a vulnerability marker related to SAD. And during a depressive episode, neuroticism and extraversion may be sensitive markers of SAD pathology. So quite interesting, the two factors, neuroticism and extraversion, being linked to depression in this study. And finally, the last study we'll look at in terms of personality by Klein et al. In 2011, Personality and Depression, Explanatory Models and Review of Evidence. So I'll just summarize what they concluded in this study. And they found that the current evidence suggests that depression is linked to traits such as neuroticism or negative emotionality, extraversion and positive emotionality, and conscientiousness. Moreover, personality characteristics appear to contribute to the onset and course of depression through a variety of pathways. And if you want to hear more about those pathways, you can read the papers in more detail. They said this has implications for prevention and prediction of treatment response. So not only does personality affect whether or not you have depression, it also affects how well you recover or respond to treatment for depression. So quite a few interesting studies here that show a very strong link between personality and mental disorders such as anxiety and depression. And therefore, that is why I say it is very important for you to understand your personality. But sometimes it can be very hard to understand your own personality. Let's face it, sometimes we don't want to face the bad sides of ourselves and our personalities. And we might not just have the tools to be able to assess that properly. So now I'm going to tell you about two tools that you can use that are tried and tested, that have been used for decades to assess your own personality type. And these two tools that I love because I've used them quite a lot in my coaching practice as well. I used them on myself when I started my coaching journey, and I've used it on my clients as well. So I found them very useful to understand your personality and to know yourself better, both in the work environment and in other environments. The first one is the DISC personality test. So DISC is a behavior assessment tool that is based on the theory of William Moulton Marston. And this theory developed into a behavioral assessment tool, and this was done by the psychologist Walton Vernon Clark. So the DISC, what it does, the DISC is an acronym. It stands for dominance, influence, steadiness, and compliance. And these are the personality characteristics that DISC assesses in you as an individual, how dominant your personality is, your influence style, your steadiness style, and your compliance style. And if you want to learn more about this, in the workbook, I do provide you with links to knowing more about the DISC, but also if you want to take the assessment, they do come at an additional fee. These are not free resources. They're not included in this program because I do not control them. But if you want to take them, you have to pay an additional fee. They would definitely help you to understand your personality better. The second one is the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, MBTI. And this has been used for a very long time as well, similarly to the DISC. And this is a self-reported questionnaire. You fill in a questionnaire similar to DISC, is also you fill in a questionnaire. And the purpose of this is to indicate different psychological preferences in how people perceive the world around them and make decisions. Myers-Briggs is a particularly interesting one because it has so many different personality types, and it will assess your personality. My personality type was found to be INTJ according to Myers-Briggs, and that is a very rare personality type, especially rarer in females. And so it helped me to understand why I behave the way I do, why I think the way I do, and why I react to situations the way I do. But you know what it helped me do also was to understand my strengths and my weaknesses. and it's helped me to be able to modify my behavior. So personality also, I believe, is modifiable. You can change it. You can learn to modify your personality. So I learned that I have certain weaknesses that I need to compensate for, or I need to make up for. And one of those was a lack of attention to detail in preparing to do something. I would always rush into doing things when I'm excited about a project or something like that. And that is a common trait of my INTJ personality, is to simply rush into things and not take time to prepare properly and so on, and rely too much on one's intuition and not so much on solid evidence, which can be a strength but can also be a weakness. And so I learned to compensate for that. I also learned to compensate for other things, like not being very appreciative of other people's opinions. Before I would be so set in my own ways or what I think is the right way to do something, I would simply, bulldoze everyone who had a different opinion. But through these personality assessments, I learned to realize that actually that can serve me well in certain circumstances, but it can also be a major weakness in other circumstances. So these days I'm more aware of that, and because of that, I can modify my behavior. So in meetings, I moderate myself. I realize that I can be pushy and overbearing, and therefore I tend to listen more to other people's opinions, but also I'm not as keen as I used to be in terms of getting my own way all the time. And so I've learned to adjust my behavior because I understand my personality better, and therefore I can capitalize on my strengths as well as limit my weaknesses. And so that's why it's important for you to take such personality tests. They will definitely be a major asset in helping you understand yourself. Childhood trauma is a rather touchy and difficult subject to handle. In my experience helping people with depression, I have found that childhood trauma is a major factor in a lot of them in terms of what led them to be depressed even in adulthood. And it is a very sad situation because there is nothing worse than being traumatized by the very people that you as a child are supposed to trust, to protect you, to nurture you, and to care for you. And when these people turn out to be the villains in your life, it can be a very hard thing to deal with. So the factors that have been found to be major factors in childhood trauma is neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse. And we'll look at a few studies around this now. Lee et al. In 2016 published a study after reviewing 80 different studies. So this was a systematic review. Now, let me just explain what that means. In a systematic review, what happens is you go out and look at the literature, the research that's been published in journals, and you take that literature and then you analyze it again. You look at the common things in that literature, what the findings were in the different studies, and sometimes you might even do what is called a meta-analysis, where you review the data from all these studies and come up with new findings based on the data from these findings. So this systematic review by Lee et al. Looked at 80 different studies that had been done on the topic of childhood trauma. So I want you to appreciate that, because we're not basing these findings on just one study. These are 80 different studies, and that's quite a lot that these findings are based on. The study was titled "Maltreatment in Childhood Substantially Increases the Risk of Adult Depression and Anxiety in Prospective Cohort Studies." This was a systematic review, meta-analysis, and proportional attributable fractions. So don't worry about the science and all that language if you do not understand. That's not the important thing here. The important thing is to understand the implications of the findings. So they found that childhood maltreatment increases the risk for depression and anxiety in adulthood. And you are twice as likely to suffer from depression of any type from any type of childhood maltreatment. So whether that's neglect, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, if you've gone through that as a child, you are twice as likely to suffer from depression than somebody who has not gone through that. And further, that you're almost 3 times as likely to suffer from anxiety from any type of childhood maltreatment. So even worse than depression, anxiety is a more common mental illness in people that have gone through childhood trauma. So pretty alarming findings there around childhood trauma and the effects it has on a person as an adult in terms of anxiety and depression from 80 different studies. Now, Lee et al. Went further to look at the risk factors for different forms of childhood trauma. And they found that if you have gone through physical abuse as a child, the odds of you having depression as an adult is 2. That's the odds ratio. So odds ratio is simply the odds of you having depression versus somebody who has not gone through that issue. So here it's, if you've gone through physical abuse, your odds of having depression is 2 times compared to somebody who has not gone through physical abuse, just to explain the meaning of some of these words. Sexual abuse, the odds ratio was even higher. You are almost 3 times as likely to suffer from depression if you've had sexual abuse. So much higher odds of you having depression from sexual abuse in childhood than from physical abuse. And neglect was slightly lower than both physical abuse and sexual abuse, at just under twice as likely. So on average, you see that those add up to twice as likely if you add them up in terms of childhood trauma affecting depression. So an interesting factor to consider, remember I said in my own experience, a lot of people who have had depression that I have helped or talked to have gone through some form of childhood trauma. They estimate that over half of global depression and anxiety cases are potentially attributable to self-reported childhood maltreatment. Now that is a lot. The WHO, World Health Organization, estimate right now is that over 350 million people suffer from depression worldwide. Now, this paper says over half of that, okay, over 150 million people who have depression can attribute it to childhood maltreatment. And so they estimate that there would be a 10 to 25% reduction, they estimate that a 10 to 25% reduction in maltreatment in childhood could potentially prevent 31.4 to 80.3 million depression and anxiety cases worldwide. That is a huge number, and that is something for you to consider and ponder over. That childhood trauma is such a huge factor. Not only does it point to problems we have in society that are growing as far as children and their rights and protection is concerned, but also the fact that we need to do something about childhood trauma if we are to tackle depression in adulthood. Moving on now to chronic illness. Chronic illness puts you at more risk of depression. And the more illnesses you have, the greater your chances of being depressed. So if you have one chronic illness, you have a higher chance of depression than somebody who does not have a chronic illness. But if you have 2 chronic illnesses, you have more chance of depression than somebody who has 1 chronic illness. So managing chronic illness well medically is one way of avoiding or handling depression if you do already have it. We're going to look at now at a few studies around that. Reed et al. In 2017 did a systematic review of 40 different studies, and it was titled Multimorbidity and Depression, a systematic review on meta-analysis. And they found that depression is 2 to 3 times more likely in people with multimorbidity compared to people without multimorbidity or those who have no chronic physical condition. And you can see that the findings there. So what they found basically was that if you have a person with more than 1 chronic condition is twice as likely to suffer from depression as a person with only 1 chronic condition. But also that a person with multiple chronic conditions, more than 2 chronic conditions, is 3 times more likely to suffer from depression than somebody without any chronic physical condition. So I hope you see the difference here. The take-home message is that the more chronic conditions you have, chronic illnesses you have, the more likely you are to suffer from depression, according to this study, this systematic review of 40 different studies by Reed et al. And they went on further to state that there was a 45% greater odds of having a depressive episode with each additional chronic condition compared to the odds of having a depressive disorder with no chronic physical condition. So each chronic condition that you have gives you a 45% higher risk of having depression, which is quite an alarming and interesting study. Thus, having a chronic illness increases likelihood of depression, and depression is more likely if illness is not well controlled or managed. And that's why I emphasized this in our earlier discussions, that If you have a chronic condition, it's important to manage it well and control it well. For instance, if you have hypertension or diabetes, because the better controlled it is, the less likely you are to suffer from depression. The worse controlled it is, the more likely you are to suffer from depression. And these are the examples of the chronic conditions that you might consider as hypertension, HIV, heart disease, lung disease, diabetes, arthritis, and stroke as examples of conditions that have been linked to depression in a strong way. Here is another study by Wang et al. In 2017. They did a systematic review of 83 different studies. And the findings of these studies, it was studies looking at outpatients, so prevalence of depression and depressive symptoms among outpatients. So people that are not admitted, that just go to a health facility to seek care, and then they go back home. And they found a significantly higher prevalence of depression and depressive symptoms observed in outpatients than in healthy controls. So all this, what this points to is that being a patient, being sick at all, increases your likelihood of having depression. And they went on to study or look at different areas of outpatients, such as otolaryngology, which is ear, nose, and throat, dermatology, which is skin, and neurology, which is the nervous system, as you know. And they found the likelihood of depression in these cases was 53%, 39, and 35. Just to give you an idea, I don't want to dwell on that too much because that is not the point of this. So the prevalence of depression and depressive symptoms was higher among outpatients in developing countries than in outpatients from developed countries. Quite an interesting finding, and perhaps pointing to the level of care or the quality of care in these different settings. But the message nonetheless is that having an illness at all, even as an outpatient, increases your likelihood of having depression. Obesity is another thing that predisposes or contributes to depression, but it's quite an interesting one because not only can it predispose you to depression, it can also be a result of depression. And we'll look at the studies around that. So that is why it's such an interesting thing, that it's like a cycle. It works both ways, as a contributing factor as well as a potential risk factor, as well as a potential result of depression. So managing your weight is very important and is one way to avoid or lessen depressive symptoms. So here is a study by Manan et al. In 2016. It was published, and they did a systematic review of 13 different studies. It's titled Prospective Association Between Depression and Obesity for Adolescent Males and Females, a systematic review, meta-analysis of longitudinal studies. So they found that obese adolescents had an increased risk of 40% of being depressed. Okay, and adolescents who were depressed had a 70% increased risk of being obese. So here's the finding, that not only did obesity contribute to risk of having depression, but depression contributed to increased risk of being obese. So the risk difference of early adolescent depression leading to obesity is 3% higher than it is for obesity leading to depression. So actually they found that there is more risk of depression leading to obesity than the other way around, than obesity leading to depression, but nevertheless both can lead to the other. The association between depression leading to obesity was greater than that of obesity leading to depression for females in early adulthood compared to females in late adolescence. So that's quite interesting as well. And they state that the bidirectional association between depression and obesity was stronger for female adolescents. So interesting study linking depression and obesity here. So one way to assess your obesity, or whether you're obese or whether you're correct weight or underweight and so on, is the body mass index. It's a very commonly used measure of body fat based on the height and weight of an individual. So the formula is basically that you take your weight in kilograms and divide it by your height squared, your height times 2 in meters. So of course it can also be, you can also utilize other measures like feet and pounds, but you have to be consistent that you apply those two together, and kilograms and meters together. And so once you do that calculation, you'll be able to determine whether you're underweight. If your result is less than 18.5, you're underweight. If your result of that calculation is between 18.5 and 24.9, you are normal weight, and that's the individual in green there. If you're overweight, you are between 25 to 29.9 in terms of your BMI, or body mass index. And if you're obese, your BMI is greater than 30 or greater. So there's classes of obesity as well. There's class 1 between 30 and 34.9, class 2 between 35 to 40, and obese class 3 above 40. So that's one way you can assess your level of obesity. Now, of course, it's very important here to be aware of your body type, because for some people this measure can lead to wrong conclusions. For instance, I used to be around 20 for a large part of my life, even below 20, so I was somewhat underweight. But I started gymming, and I put on a lot of muscle. So because of that, my BMI now is leaning more towards overweight. But of course, I'm not worried about that, because I know that I have put on good muscle. I've put on good weight. I've put on muscle. I would be worried about that if it was fat that I had put on. But because I know it's because of gymming and it's good weight, it's muscle, I don't worry about that. Similarly, for a person who is big boned, some people just have a bigger structure than others, and therefore BMI may not be ideal for you to measure whether you're obese or not. You might need to use other measures of assessing body fat in order to assess that. But nevertheless, for the majority of people, BMI is a very good measure for knowing whether you are obese or not. Cigarette smoking is something that has been found to be linked with depression. Now, cigarette smoking is harmful to you in so many different ways. There is basically no system of your body that is not affected by smoking. But cigarette smoking puts you at a higher risk of depression. It has other health impact. Remember, I said if you have another illness, such as lung cancer, that you can develop from cigarette smoking, it can put you at higher risk of depression too. And further, depressed smokers have a harder time quitting smoking. So those are some of the things to consider when it comes to smoking. And let's look at a few studies around that. Luger et al. Did a systematic review of 85 different studies in 2014 titled How Robust is the Association Between Smoking and Depression in Adults? And they had quite a few interesting findings. They found that in cross-sectional studies, smoking was associated with a nearly twofold increased risk of depression compared to both non-smokers and former smokers. In the smaller set of prospective studies, the odds of subsequent depression were also higher for current than never smokers. In cross-sectional studies, current smokers were more likely to be depressed than never smokers, and those are the odds ratios in brackets there. And current smokers were more likely to be depressed than former smokers. Further, smokers had greater odds of incident depression at follow-up than never smokers. So what does this mean? These findings mean that they basically found that from all these 85 different studies, if you're a smoker, you're more likely to suffer from depression than somebody who has never smoked, or than somebody that has smoked before and quit smoking. But also that if you're a smoker, you're less likely to have depression subsequently. In other words, you're less likely to recover from depression than somebody who has never smoked or somebody that has quit smoking. Fluharty et al. In 2017 published a study called The Association of Cigarette Smoking with Depression and Anxiety. And they reviewed 148 different studies on smoking and depression and anxiety. That is a huge number of studies for any systematic review. Their findings from these, or conclusions from these 148 studies, was that smoking exposure was associated with later depression and anxiety. So that if you're a smoker, you're more likely to have depression and anxiety. And there was nearly half the studies that reported that baseline depression and anxiety was associated with some type of later smoking behavior. So in other words, if somebody was depressed or anxious at the beginning of these studies, they were more likely to start smoking or be smoking later on when they were seen. So what does this mean? This means that smoking not only predisposes you to depression, but depression itself can also lead to you smoking. So quite interesting findings in the link between depression and smoking here. And finally, the last study we'll look at in terms of smoking by Weinberger et al. published in 2017, was a systematic review of 45 different studies titled Depression and Cigarette Smoking Behavior, a Critical Review of Population-Based Studies. They found that persons with depression, compared to those without depression, are more likely to smoke and meet the criteria for nicotine dependence, and are less likely to quit smoking, and are more likely to relapse. Okay? Persons with depression are more likely to smoke cigarettes and have greater difficulty quitting smoking. So another interesting one, linking more the effects of depression leading to smoking rather than the other way around, by Weinberger et al. So that's why I say it's important to understand yourself. So are you a smoker that is depressed? Could this be the thing that is contributing to your depression? You need to understand yourself in terms of these personal habits and how they might be affecting both your risk of depression or you going through depression and your chances of recovering from depression. Alcohol dependence is another factor that has been studied as far as depression goes. So alcohol dependence increases the likelihood of depression, but depression itself can lead to alcohol dependence through self-medication. A lot of people who try to cope with depression, whether or not they know they are depressed or not, by taking alcohol, and it's considered a form of self-medication in depression. But alcohol, like tobacco, affects every system in your body in a bad way. And sickness brought on by alcohol itself can contribute further to depression. So let's look now at a few studies around alcohol and depression. Borden and Ferguson, you can see here there's no et al. Because it's just two authors, so we can list them all. Borden and Ferguson in 2011 did a systematic review of 16 different studies, and it was simply titled Alcohol and Depression. And they found that the presence of either disorder, that is alcohol dependence disorder, or depression, doubled the risk of the second disorder. So in other words, depression doubled the risk of you being dependent on alcohol. Alcohol doubled the risk of you being depressed. Epidemiological data suggests that the linkages between the disorders cannot be accounted for fully by common factors that influence both alcohol use dependence and major depressive disorder, and that the disorders appear to be linked in a causal manner. So that's a very strong association if one says it's a causal manner. Further evidence suggests that the most plausible causal association between alcohol use dependence and major depressive disorder is one in which alcohol use dependence increases the risk of major depression rather than vice versa. So quite interesting. They concluded that you're more likely to suffer from depression from alcohol use than depression leading to alcohol dependence, although that can happen, but the risk is greater the other way around. And they state that the potential mechanism underlying these causal linkages include neurophysiological and metabolic changes resulting from alcohol exposure. So in other words, they are actually saying that alcohol actually causes changes to the way your body functions on a neurological and metabolic level that actually predisposes you to having depression. So that is why it's very important to understand your habits in terms of alcohol as well. How is alcohol affecting you as an individual in terms of your depression? Is it something you need to do something about? Smartphone use and problematic smartphone use, a touchy subject for most of us, because smartphones these days have become almost an extension of our bodies. We take them wherever we go. They sleep next to our beds. When we are far from our smartphones, we feel anxious. We feel like we're missing out on something. So this is quite a touchy subject in that area, because for most people, it's almost a part of them. So they fail to see how it can be a problem. But smartphones can be addictive. They can contribute to isolation and loneliness, which are factors in depression that we'll cover on other days. They can erode relationships and can contribute to anxiety and depression. And let's look at some studies around that. So Elhae et al. In 2017 did a systematic review of 23 different studies, and they titled this Problematic Smartphone Use, a Conceptual Overview and Systematic Review of Relations with Anxiety and Depression Psychopathology. So they found that there were several causal pathways toward problematic smartphone use that have been proposed in the literature they reviewed, and that depression severity and anxiety severity were consistently related to problem smartphone use. So the more you used your smartphone in a bad way, in other words, if you are addicted to your smartphone, you're more likely to have depression and anxiety, and they're more likely to be worse in severity. Stress was somewhat consistently related to problematic smartphone use, and they also found that self-esteem was consistently related to problem smartphone use. So they found a strong link between depression and anxiety, stress, and self-esteem relating to problematic smartphone use. So that is the question for you today. Is your smartphone a problem for you as far as depression and anxiety goes? Is it something you need to address? Is it something you need to do something about? Let's look briefly at chronic stress and some things that can contribute to that, such as death of a loved one, loss of a relationship, such as divorce, separation, or breakup, domestic violence. There is also post-traumatic stress disorder, which is occurs after witnessing violence or being a victim of violence, car accidents, warfare, and so on. I don't mean to present an exhaustive list here. The point is that chronic stress can contribute to depression, and chronic stress is something that one needs to address as far as depression goes. One of the biggest causes of chronic stress for a lot of people is work, because let's face it, a lot of us spend a lot of time at work. We spend more time at work than anything else we do in life. So Sigrist in 2018 did a systematic review of 12 different studies on work-related stress, and this was titled Chronic Psychosocial Stress at Work and Risk of Depression, Evidence from Prospective Studies. They found that consistently elevated odds ratio of about 1.8 of depression among men and women who were exposed to high demand and low control at work. So in other words, if you're stressed at work, you're almost twice as likely to suffer from depression according to these findings. And those who spend high efforts in combination with low rewards received in return. So if you feel like you're putting in a lot of effort at work and not getting the rewards from that effort, you're more likely to have stress at work and therefore more likely to suffer from depression. They found that there is solid evidence of a prospectively established moderate association of chronic psychosocial work stress as defined by theoretical models with depression. So in other words, work-related stress can contribute to depression according to this study by Sigrist, which looked at 12 different studies. And therefore, it is important for you to understand your work environment and your work style. Could your work environment, your relationships at work be contributing to your stress levels and therefore your risk of depression or your ability to recover from depression? Now, as far as understanding yourself, there are also other things to consider, such as physical activity, diet, and your environment. And I'm not going to discuss this in more detail today because we've covered a lot. These are discussed on other days that we'll go through them and go through the studies on them as well and look at what you need to do to address them. So go ahead and look at the exercises in the workbook for today. Look at the additional materials you need to look into, the expert insights videos, and if you want to read more about the research we've discussed today in more detail, look at the papers that are attached for you to download to this presentation, as well as the summaries of these papers. The take-home message here is that depression has many risk factors. Depression has many factors that affect how well you recover from it. And you as an individual need to understand yourself with respect to those risk factors. What is your personality? What is your work environment like? What is your lifestyle like? What are the things that you do that could be contributing to your depression or that need addressing as far as depression? What are the things that happened to you in the past that could be important factors for you to address in order to adequately handle and heal from your depression? Those are the things that you need to focus on, and those are the things that are discussed in this presentation. And we'll discuss some of them on other days and how you can handle them, but I think you now get a good idea of what I mean when I say you are the key, because you need to understand yourself in terms of these factors. And you can see that they're so unique to individuals that nobody could come up with a one solution for everybody as far as depression goes. It's important to understand yourself, understand that you are the key, because even when you seek professional help, you need to understand what areas to focus on, what areas you need to deal with and you need help with, whether it's alcohol, whether it's smoking, whether it's obesity, whether it's childhood trauma. You need to understand those so that you can even get the most from professional help when you need it. So I hope you've enjoyed today's presentation. Go through the exercises, apply this learning to yourself, and we'll see you next time on the Ultimate Depression Survival Kit.